The candles on the table flickered lightly, casting uneasy shadows across the restaurant walls. My gaze fixed on the couple in the distance, laughing as if they were alone in the world. I had felt this uneasiness before, that suffocating distrust that slowly grows, but I never imagined I would be confronted by it in such a brutal way. There she was, my wife, with a man I could only assume was her lover. As the waiter served the wine, I noticed his wide smile, the same one that was just mine before. The anguish in his chest was replaced by a cold kind of determination. I got up and approached slowly, each step resounding like a drum in the room. When I finally stopped at the edge of the table, she looked up, surprised but not embarrassed. She frowned, almost as if I was the one doing something wrong. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice filled with impatience, but also with something darker. It was defense. I took a deep breath, controlling the anger that threatened to boil over. I could ask the same. My gaze passed from his eyes to the man in front of him, who now avoided looking at me, fidgeting with his wine glass like a coward. "So that's how it is. Is that the reason for all those work meetings at night?" She crossed her arms and smiled, but there was something acidic in her expression. "Don't be dramatic. It doesn't have to be like this. You were always so jealous. This is exactly why we are in this situation." "Jealous?" I murmured, feeling the bitter taste of those words. I leaned in, looking her straight in the eyes. "I was jealous because I loved you. But you know what? You are free now. Free to live with him, if that's what you want. It's all over. I'm going to file for divorce, and your family will know about it." For the first time, I saw panic in his eyes. She opened her eyes wide and tried to hide it, but the mask slipped. "No, wait. It doesn't have to be like this. We can solve this." The words came out hurriedly, almost pleadingly, as she reached out her hand to touch mine. I walked away, raising my hands in a gesture of rejection. Solve? Like it was a minor problem, a technical issue. You destroyed our life. There is no going back from this. I turned to my lover, who now seemed more uncomfortable than ever. "I hope she's worth the chaos that just entered your life." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of glasses clinking on distant tables. I left the restaurant feeling the weight of the world, but also with a strange sense of relief. It was as if, as devastating as it was, a truth had been revealed, and I finally had a clear path to follow. The next few hours were a blur of confused thoughts and impulsive decisions. When I got home, the silence seemed thicker than ever. I wandered through the rooms, remembering all the times I thought we had something special, all the sacrifices I made to keep our marriage intact. And now, all that effort seemed like just an illusion. I sat on the couch, staring into space, until an idea began to form, gaining strength by the minute. I would not just be a passive victim of this disaster. No. They would feel the consequences of the choices they made. The next day, I started executing my plan. I called a lawyer, clarified the details of the divorce and made sure it would be quick and painful for her. But the real surprise was yet to come. I planned a family dinner for next weekend. Everyone would be there, her parents, our closest friends, even some coworkers she looked up to. They would hear the truth directly from me, without filters. If she wanted to live a life of deceit and betrayal, let her be responsible for them. As the day of the dinner approached, she tried to contact me several times, leaving voicemails that alternated between tearful apologies and desperate pleas. I deleted each one of them, without giving any answers. With each ring of the phone, I felt less love, less guilt. She had chosen this path, and now she would face every step of the way. On the night of the dinner, the tension in the air was palpable. I arrived a little early to organize everything, making sure the surprise would be revealed at the right time. When she entered, I saw the hesitation in her steps. She knew something was wrong. And she was right. I waited until everyone was served and comfortable in their chairs. Then I stood up, toasting honesty and respect. Her expression hardened, and I knew she was trying to decipher what was coming next. I want to share something important with you. Something that has been heavy on my heart. My voice was firm, but carried the weight of truth. I recently discovered that my marriage was built on a lie. My wife decided that our vows were not enough, that I was not enough. So, she looked for something more. And he found it. I pointed at her, while the silence in the room became unbearable. She stood up abruptly. This is absurd. Can't we discuss this in private? His voice was shaking, but there was a mixture of anger and shame in his eyes. No, dear. My voice was cold as ice. The lies have been private for too long. Now it's time to make them public. As the murmur began to fill the room, I felt a wave of relief. As real as the pain was, I knew I had done what was right. But that was just the surface. The true outcome of this story was just beginning. And I knew, deep in my heart, that the twists and turns were yet to come. Welcome to our channel, where we never, under any circumstances, support or justify any form of betrayal. Here, all the stories are fictional, but they carry an important message. Betrayal is capable of destroying lives, trust and everything that was built with love. Get ready to dive into an intense narrative, full of twists and turns, that will show the relentless consequences of wrong choices. Now, sit back and prepare for a story that will shock you and hold your attention until the last second. Good story. The sound of the wind passed through the half-open windows of the brick house on the edge of the quiet neighborhood, where Alex and Helena's lives seemed to follow a carefully written script. Married for almost a decade, they represented what many imagined to be the perfect balance between love, friendship and companionship. Alex, a 38-year-old man, was a civil engineer, known for his meticulousness and commitment to everything he did. Helena, aged 35, had transformed her passion for writing into a career as an author of children's books, something that kept her connected to her most creative and dreamy side. Their routine was, in the eyes of those observing from the outside, serene and predictable. Alex was the first to get up, usually before sunrise, and started his day with a morning run, something he said cleared his mind for the demands of work. Helena, in turn, had a calmer pace. He liked to drink his coffee while reviewing manuscripts or making notes for his next stories, often sketching characters that reflected pieces of his own life. They shared household chores with a silent harmony that, for many, was the symbol of a successful marriage. But behind the closed doors, small signs of wear began to form, although they were barely noticeable. Alex, increasingly involved in complex projects at work, spent more time away from home, arriving many nights late and exhausted. Helena, who previously found comfort and security in the predictability of the routine, began to feel isolated, as if her conversations had become automatic, more superficial than she would like. The easy smile that Alex always brought home seemed to have lost some of its shine, and Helena's laughter, so frequent in the first years of marriage, now only sounded on special occasions. The couple's closest friends noticed the subtle changes, but none of them dared to mention it. For Helena's parents, the relationship seemed intact. They admired Alex for his stability and trusted that he was the right man to take care of their daughter. Alex's co-workers saw him as someone balanced, dedicated to both his family and his career, an almost unattainable figure in terms of success. The house they shared was spacious, decorated with care by Helena, who had an eye for details that reflected their personalities. Photographs from their trips together filled the living room walls, each telling a story of happy times, the honeymoon in Santorini, a birthday celebrated in Paris, a spontaneous getaway to the mountains. Books filled the shelves, a reflection of the nights they used to spend reading together, when they still seemed inseparable. Despite everything, there was a growing feeling of emptiness, especially for Helena. She noticed that Alex was more distant, but she avoided confronting him directly, afraid of exposing something she didn't know if she could fix. He, on the other hand, thought he was doing everything right by providing financial and emotional stability, without realizing that his emotional absence was beginning to create cracks. One afternoon, while organizing papers in her home office, Helena found a photo album that she hadn't seen in years. The pages were full of memories, moments captured in candid photos and genuine smiles. A sigh escaped her lips as she ran her fingers along the edges of an image that showed Alex holding her hand during a sunset. That passionate look he had seemed like a distant memory now, and she wondered if he still saw her the same way. Alex, meanwhile, was driving home from work, caught up in thoughts about the mounting deadlines. He tried hard to ignore the nagging feeling that something in his marriage had changed. He preferred to believe that these were natural phases of life together, that with time everything would return to normal. However, he also knew that the nights of deep conversation, the long walks hand in hand, now seemed like memories of another couple, not theirs. That night, as they ate dinner, the silence at the table was almost deafening. Conversations that once flowed easily now seemed to require effort. Helena talked about her new book project, but Alex seemed distant, responding in monosyllables. When he finally looked at her, there was something in his gaze that Helena couldn't decipher, a mix of tiredness and something deeper that he didn't express. "Are you well?" she asked, breaking the silence. Alex nodded, but his response seemed automatic, like he didn't want to delve deeper. Helena felt the familiar wave of frustration, but swallowed it down, remaining calm. They finished dinner in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. While Alex went up to his room, Helena stayed in the kitchen, looking out the window at the garden they had planted together years ago. The flowers were still blooming, but the garden looked neglected, as if it reflected what was happening between them. She pursed her lips, feeling a lump in her throat, but pushed the feeling away, telling herself that tomorrow would be a new day. In the days that followed, the routine continued. Alex left early and returned late, and Helena tried to fill her time with her books and occasional visits to friends. She started going to a coffee shop near her home, where she spent hours writing and observing the people around her. It was a small escape, a way to feel part of something bigger, even if for a few moments. One afternoon, while working on a new draft, Helena was approached by a stranger, a man who had noticed her sketches and praised her ability to capture emotions in words. The conversation was brief and cordial, but it left Helena with a discreet smile, something she hadn't felt in a long time. When he returned home that evening, there was a lightness in his step that Alex didn't notice as he was stuck in yet another phone meeting. Just like that, the days turned into weeks, and the space between them seemed to grow even more. Helena's attempts to rekindle the flame were met with distraction, and Alex, trapped in his own world, didn't even notice that she had stopped trying. They still shared the same roof, the same bed, but they were living completely different lives. Time seemed to be their greatest enemy, slowly eroding what was once a vibrant love full of possibilities. Both were trapped in a cycle of silence and routine, unable to recognize that as they struggled to keep up appearances, the distance between them only grew. What they didn't know was that this apparent calm was about to be destroyed by events that would change their lives forever, leaving behind marks that none of them could have predicted. The days continued to pass, filled with routine that seemed more like a survival mechanism than a life lived together. Alex immersed himself even more in his work, dealing with deadlines that he created himself, perhaps as a way of justifying the growing distance between him and Helena. She, on the other hand, had given up hoping for a spontaneous change and started looking for distractions that would keep her busy, filling the void with commitments that meant little, but that gave the feeling of movement. They were increasingly like two strangers sharing a common space, living parallel lives. One night, Alex arrived home earlier than usual, something rare in recent months. The sound of the key turning in the lock echoed through the silent house. He was used to finding Helena in the office or living room, always absorbed in a book or scribbling ideas for a new story, but when he entered, the emptiness seemed even heavier. The house had that feeling of pause, that someone had rushed out and left things behind. There was a half-empty cup of tea on the kitchen counter, a book open on the couch, and a scribbled note with a vague reminder, but no Helena. He tried to ignore the pang of worry that came with her absence, telling himself that she must be on a walk or perhaps at the coffee shop she frequented. Helena, in fact, was in the cafeteria, but not alone. Sitting at a table near the window, she chatted animatedly with Lucas, the man who had praised her work a few weeks ago. The initial casual meeting had evolved into more frequent conversations, first about literature, then about life in general. Lucas was charming in an unassuming way, someone who asked genuine questions and seemed to really listen to the answers. He laughed easily and made Helena feel interesting in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. She tried to convince herself that there was nothing wrong with connecting with someone who appreciated her work and her company, but deep down, she knew she was approaching a fine line. As they talked, Lucas leaned forward slightly, as if he wanted to capture every word Helena said. She noticed the intensity in his eyes and the way he occasionally touched her hand to emphasize something, gestures that were subtle but ignited something inside her. For the first time in years, she felt seen. When the clock struck 7 p.m., she got up with a smile and said goodbye, promising to meet Lucas again soon. On the way home, the weight of guilt began to set in, but it was quickly drowned out by the memory of the conversation and the feeling of lightness it brought. The following weeks brought a noticeable change in Helena's energy. Alex noticed that she was more radiant, more attentive to the little things around her, but also more distant. She seemed to be physically present, but his mind often wandered, and he began to feel like there was something she wasn't saying. He tried to ignore the feeling, chalking it up to his own tiredness, but doubt crept in, growing silently in his mind. One night, while Helena was taking a shower, Alex saw her cell phone on the kitchen counter. He wasn't the type to invade her privacy, but something that night compelled him to pick up the device. With a knot in his stomach, he unlocked his phone and opened the messaging app. He didn't have to look far to find the evidence that confirmed his suspicions. There were messages exchanged between Helena and Lucas, filled with an intimacy that cut like a blade. He read every word, every laugh shared, every plan for future dates. Alex's chest felt like it was burning, a mixture of anger and pain spreading throughout his body. He put the cell phone back exactly where it was and went up to the bedroom, lying down next to Helena when she came out of the bathroom, pretending that nothing had happened. In the following days, Alex watched Helena's every movement with increased attention, noticing gestures that previously went unnoticed. The way she smiled while looking at her cell phone, the increasingly frequent excuses to leave the house, the sparkle in her eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time and that, now, he knew wasn't for him. Each moment was like a silent blow, but he remained calm, waiting for the right moment to confront her. Then the day came that would change everything. Alex finished work early and decided to do something he hadn't done in months, pick up Helena from the coffee shop. When he parked the car across the street, his eyes fixed on the scene on the other side of the window. There she was, sitting at the same table as always, but she wasn't alone. Lucas was next to her, laughing, as he held her hand across the table. It was a vision he didn't need to confirm, but he did so nonetheless. He got out of the car, crossed the street and entered the cafe. Helena looked up as he stopped next to the table, her face lighting up with surprise and embarrassment. "Alex? What are you doing here?" Her voice shook slightly, but she tried to maintain her composure. Alex didn't respond immediately, his eyes alternating between Helena and Lucas, who now looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his napkin as if he wanted to disappear. Alex finally spoke, his voice cool and controlled. "I should be the one to ask that." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the muffled sound of conversations around. Helena tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Alex looked straight at her, his expression a mixture of pain and disappointment. "I don't think I need any explanations," he said, turning to leave. Helena sat there, paralyzed, while Lucas looked away, clearly aware of the weight of the situation. Alex left the cafe, each step heavy with the reality he had just faced. He didn't know exactly what the next step would be, but he knew that the point of return was behind him. A new stage was about to begin, and he was determined not to let it be defined by the betrayal he had just witnessed. The night was dark and silent, as if the world itself had stopped to hold its breath at what was about to happen. Alex sat alone in the living room, the low lights casting shadows on his face marked by exhaustion and pain. He still felt the impact of the scene he had witnessed days before, the betrayal embedded in his mind like a scar that would not heal anytime soon. In his hands he held a thick envelope, heavy not because of the material, but because of the meaning contained inside. It was a silent weapon, the last piece of a puzzle he didn't want to have to put together. Helena walked in the door shortly after 9 at night, as had been happening lately. She hesitated when she saw him sitting there, his eyes fixed on an undefined point. There was something different about the atmosphere in the house, something that made her stop for a second before forcing herself to walk towards him. "Are you awake yet?" "I thought you had already gone to sleep," she said, trying to sound casual, but her voice betrayed a tension she could barely hide. Alex looked up, and the silence between them was almost palpable. He didn't respond right away, letting the weight of that moment grow. Then he finally spoke, his voice calm, but filled with an intensity that made Helena catch her breath. "We need to talk. Now." She felt her heart race, fear and guilt colliding in her chest. He tried to maintain his composure, but he knew something was about to change forever. She sat on the couch opposite him, her hands restless in her lap. "About what?" he asked, although the answer was clear in his mind. Alex held the envelope for a moment before placing it on the table between them. He pushed it towards her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Open this. It's important." Helena took the envelope with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of Alex's expectation. She opened it slowly, pulling out the papers inside. For a moment, his gaze was confused, but as he read the words at the top of the page, the blood seemed to freeze in his veins. It was detailed documentation about her lover, Lucas. But it wasn't just about their relationship. The pages were full of information she never imagined he could have discovered. Lucas, as she knew, wasn't just a stranger in her life. He had a direct connection to something she never imagined coming to light. "What?" she began, but her voice trailed off. She tried to start again, but Alex interrupted her, her voice now sharp as a blade. "I thought you had the right to know exactly who Lucas is. Or rather, who he is to me." Helena looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. His mind desperately tried to put the pieces together, but Alex didn't give him time. He stood up, pacing the room with nervous energy. "Did you know that I never talk about my past, about my childhood? Did you think it was because I'm reserved, because I didn't want to burden you with the traumas from before you met me? Well, part of that is true, but the other part is because I never thought I'd need to think about it again. Until you brought this man into our lives." Helena felt a lump form in her throat as Alex continued, his voice now thick with emotions he had kept buried for so long. "Lucas isn't just a stranger you met in a coffee shop. He is the man who destroyed my family. He is the reason my mother suffered years of humiliation and betrayal. He was her lover, Helena. The same man who watched my father be consumed by pain and shame before finally abandoning us. And now, somehow, he's here, again, like a parasite, trying to destroy everything I've built." Helena could barely process the words she heard. Her heart was beating wildly, and a wave of panic began to rise within her. Alex's words echoed like thunder, each revelation hitting her like a sharp blow. She tried to speak, but Alex raised his hand, cutting her off again. "I don't know if you knew that or if he told you. Maybe he manipulated you, like he manipulated my mother, but that doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that you allowed him to come into our lives, that you chose this, Helena. It wasn't a mistake or a slip. It was a choice." Tears started to roll down her face, but Alex didn't give in. He stood before her now, his eyes fixed on hers, demanding an answer he knew she couldn't give. I didn't know," he managed to say, his voice almost a whisper. Alex, I had no idea. He never said anything about it. I swear, I never wanted to hurt you. He laughed, but the sound was filled with bitterness. He pulled away, running his hands through his hair, trying to regain control of his emotions. Do you think this changes anything? That the fact that you don't know makes what you did less painful? Helena, you destroyed what we had. You allowed a man like him to be part of our history. There is no going back from this. She stood up, tears now falling freely as she tried to reach him, but he took a step back, raising his hand to keep her distance. No. Don't try to fix it now. Don't try to convince me it was a mistake, because it wasn't. And I won't let you fool me again. The silence that followed was suffocating. Helena felt her world crumble around her, Alex's words echoing like a final sentence. He grabbed his keys and left, leaving her alone in the middle of a room that now seemed cold and empty. Helena fell onto the sofa, holding the papers that were still in her hands. Every word on those pages seemed to scream the truth she had ignored. The man she thought was an escape from her monotony was, in fact, a ghost from Alex's past, an echo of a pain she never imagined reliving. She knew she had lost something she could never get back, but what she didn't yet know was that the consequences of her choices were just beginning. The world as she knew it was about to change irreversibly, and the control she thought she had over her life was slipping through her fingers. Helena couldn't move, the weight of the silence in the house was almost tangible. The papers Alex had left fell from his hands and scattered across the floor like a reflection of his fragmented mind. Every word he had said echoed in her head, and the truth she had just discovered seemed impossible to process. Lucas, the man who seemed to be a breath of newness in his monotonous life, was in fact a shadow of Alex's past, a central figure in the trauma he had carried throughout his life. Her throat felt tight, as if the air had been knocked from her lungs. It wasn't just the guilt of her betrayal that crushed her now, but the depth of the mistake she'd made in letting Lucas get involved. The hours dragged on until dawn, but Helena remained motionless, staring into space. Finally, as the sun began to shyly peek through the windows, she picked up the phone. There were so many calls I wanted to make, but only one number seemed to make sense at that moment. Trembling, she dialed Lucas. He answered on the third try, his voice still thick with sleep. Helena. Everything is fine. He asked, without hiding his tiredness. We need to talk. Now, she said, her voice firm but carrying a tension that he certainly noticed. What happened? Why do you look so? He began, but she interrupted him. Just meet me at the coffee shop in half an hour. Lucas hesitated for a moment, but agreed. Helena hung up without giving any further explanation and started to get dressed. His mind worked frantically, rehearsing every question he would ask, every detail he would demand to know. But behind it all, there was a deeper question: how could she have been so blind? When he arrived at the cafeteria, Lucas was already there, sitting at the same table where they usually talked, the same carefree smile on his lips. But this time, the smile didn't comfort her. She sat across from him, ignoring the gentle greetings he tried to give. His expression was cold, almost distant, something that made Lucas frown. What is happening? You're scaring me, he said, leaning slightly toward her. Helena placed her hands on the table, fingers intertwined to keep them from shaking. Alex found out everything. About us. And that's not all, Lucas. He knows who you are. Or rather, who you were. Lucas leaned back, the smile fading from his face. He was silent for a few moments, his eyes assessing Helena, as if trying to gauge how much she knew. I don't know what you're talking about, he said finally, but his voice betrayed a slight tremor. Don't lie to me. Not now, she replied, her voice louder than she intended. He told me. About his relationship with his mother. About how you destroyed his family. Why didn't you tell me, Lucas? Why did you let me dive into this without knowing the truth? Lucas took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair as if trying to buy time to formulate a response. He looked around, making sure no one was paying attention to the conversation. "I didn't tell you because I thought it wasn't relevant. That was a long time ago, Helena. I was someone else. Things were different." Helena laughed, but there was no humor in her laughter. It was bitter, full of disbelief. "Wasn't it relevant? You destroyed my husband's family, Lucas. And now it's here, as if nothing had happened, repeating it all over again, but with a new victim. Don't you see the pattern? Don't you realize how sick this is?" Lucas narrowed his eyes, his expression hardening. He crossed his arms, leaning forward. "And you? Do you think you are completely innocent in this story? Wasn't it you who came to me, who wanted this as much as I did? Don't pretend this was all my idea, Helena. You knew what you were doing from the beginning." His words hit her like a slap. She opened her mouth to respond, but stopped. There was a painful truth in what he said, a truth she didn't want to admit. She looked away, trying to process everything. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, almost a whisper. "It doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I need to understand what you want from all of this. Did you know who Alex was from the beginning? Or was this just a cruel coincidence?" Lucas hesitated, and for the first time she saw something that looked like genuine vulnerability in his eyes. "I knew. From day one, I knew. And, yes, at first, I thought it might be a way to settle the score, perhaps. But then I met you, and that changed everything. I fell in love with you, Helena. It wasn't supposed to be a game. It wasn't supposed to be like this." She felt the ground open beneath her feet. The anger he had felt moments before began to give way to something deeper, darker. It was as if all the pieces were finally falling into place, but the picture they formed was terribly distorted. "Did you use my pain, my loneliness, to get revenge on him?" she asked, her voice breaking at the end. Lucas shook his head, but the gesture seemed more like a reflex than a clear answer. "It wasn't like that, Helena. I swear it wasn't." She didn't respond. She stood up slowly, picking up her bag and looking at him one last time. "I never want to see you again, Lucas. Don't contact me. Don't try to look for me. That's over." She left before he could respond, leaving him alone at the table. Outside, the cool morning air felt like a shock against his skin, but not enough to clear his mind. She began to walk aimlessly, each step heavier than the last. Meanwhile, Alex was in a lawyer's office, discussing next steps. He knew that the decision to confront Helena and expose the betrayal was just the beginning. There was more to be done, more to be resolved. He looked out the window, seeing the movement of the street below, and felt a mixture of relief and sadness. As painful as it was, he knew he was finally taking back control of his life. And in that moment, he swore to himself that he would never allow anyone to take that away from him again. Helena spent the next few days in a dense fog, as if she were living in a parallel reality where everything around her seemed familiar but completely different. The house that once represented a refuge now seemed like a hostile space, filled with suffocating silences and memories that she didn't know if she could bear. Alex still hadn't returned since the night it all came to a head, and she had no idea where he was or what he intended to do. His absence was a constant reminder of what she had lost and what she might never get back. She tried to follow a routine, but each attempt felt artificial. Writing, which was once his escape, now seemed like an impossible task. The words didn't come, and the blank pages only reflected the emptiness she felt. She looked at her phone several times a day, waiting for a call or text from Alex, something that would signal that he was willing to talk, to rebuild, but his silence was deafening. Meanwhile, Alex was dealing with his own internal storm. He had temporarily moved into a small apartment that belonged to a friend, a simple, functional space that offered the bare minimum for him to focus on what needed to be done. He spent his nights reviewing the divorce documents, making sure every detail was in order, and his days were divided between work and meetings with his lawyer. But behind this facade of productivity, there was a man trying to understand how his life had gotten to this point. He couldn't sleep at night without hearing Helena's words echoing in his mind. "I never wanted to hurt you," was a phrase that seemed to repeat itself endlessly, but the idea that she had not only hurt, but destroyed something he held sacred, made the phrase almost insulting. He asked himself repeatedly if there was anything he could have done to prevent all of this, if the estrangement he knew had contributed to their emotional separation was enough justification for her choices. But every time these doubts arose, he quickly dismissed them, telling himself that betrayal was a choice, not an inevitable consequence. Days turned into weeks, and Helena finally decided she couldn't wait any longer. She needed to face Alex, needed to at least try to understand what he was thinking, even if the answer was something she didn't want to hear. She drove to the address she got from a mutual friend, the place where Alex was staying. When she arrived, she parked the car and sat for a few minutes, trying to gather the courage to leave. The building was simple, lacking the grandeur of the house they had shared, but it seemed suitable for someone trying to escape the chaos. She took a deep breath and got out of the car, walking up the stairs with hesitant steps. When Alex opened the door, his expression was unreadable. He looked tired, but not surprised to see her there. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter without saying a word. Helena entered, looking around, noticing the simplicity of the space. It was strange to see him there, so different from the man she knew, but at the same time so incredibly familiar. "I needed to see you," she said finally, breaking the silence that seemed to weigh between them like an invisible barrier. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to meet, but I couldn't continue without at least trying to talk to you." Alex crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. He didn't say anything, just looked at her, waiting for her to continue. "I know that everything I say now will seem empty, but I'm sorry. More than you can imagine. I don't know how I got to this point, how I allowed all of this to happen, but I know it was a mistake, and I will never stop regretting it." Alex finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "A mistake, Helena? Is that what you call it? It wasn't an accident. It wasn't something that just happened to you. It was a choice. A choice you made over and over again. You knew what you were doing and chose to do it anyway." Helena felt tears pool in her eyes, but she blinked quickly, trying to keep them under control. "I know. I know it was a choice, and I'm not trying to apologize for it. Just I need you to know that, despite everything, I never stopped loving you. I know it's hard to believe this now, but it's the truth." Alex let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Love? Is this what you call love? Because, to me, it seems like the opposite of that. It seems selfish. You wanted something that I wasn't giving you, and instead of talking to me, instead of trying to resolve it, you looked for someone else. That's not love, Helena. This is cowardice." His words were like stabs, but Helena knew he was right. She had no way of refuting what he said, because everything he pointed out was the truth. She lowered her head, feeling the weight of her own guilt. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I hope that one day you can find someone who makes you happy again. Because you deserve it, Alex. More than anyone." Alex was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer, but still filled with pain. "I don't know if I can forgive. Not now. Maybe never. But as much as it hurts me to say this, I hope you find some way to move on too. Because honestly, Helena, I don't think there's anything left for us here." She nodded, tears finally flowing freely down her face. They were silent for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. Then, Helena slowly got up, knowing it was time to go. She looked at Alex one last time, trying to memorize every detail of his face, knowing that this moment could be the last they would share. She left without saying anything else, closing the door softly behind her. When she reached her car, she allowed the tears to come in full force, the weight of the loss finally hitting her. She knew she had crossed a point of no return, but even so, she felt a small spark of hope that somehow they could both find a new beginning, even if they were apart. Alex, on the other hand, stood in the same place where Helena left him, looking at the closed door. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a small wave of relief. The conversation hadn't resolved anything, but there was something cathartic about finally getting it all out in the open. He knew he still had a long way to go, but he was ready to start walking. Time passed, as it always passes, indifferent to the wounds it leaves behind. Alex and Helena went their separate ways, both carrying the scars of a marriage that had ended not just in betrayal, but in painful revelations that forever changed their perceptions of each other and themselves. For Alex, the initial days after the divorce were the most challenging. Pain was a constant companion, manifesting itself in moments of absolute silence, when the emptiness seemed to scream loudest. He tried to focus on his work, but even the structured logic of his profession wasn't enough to keep the thoughts away. It was during a business meeting that he met Sophie, a new hire on the marketing team. Sophie was smart, funny, and most of all, she seemed to see Alex in a way he had forgotten was possible. They began working on projects together, and the partnership quickly grew into something more. Alex was careful, hesitant to allow himself to feel again, but Sophie was patient. She didn't try to fix him or erase the past, but she offered a gentle, steady presence that helped him rebuild his confidence. Meanwhile, Helena struggled to find meaning in a life that seemed irreparably broken. She moved into a small apartment, leaving behind the house she had shared with Alex, but the memories continued to haunt her. She tried to write again, but the words felt out of reach, as if the part of her soul that fueled her creativity had been lost. It was during a rainy afternoon, while organizing boxes of books, that she found the manuscript of a story she had started years before. It was a children's tale about loss and redemption, something she had never finished. Inspired, she decided to take it up again. Working on that story became a therapeutic process, a way of dealing with her pain and turning it into something meaningful. Lucas, on the other hand, faced his own consequences. After separating from Helena, he tried to return to his routine, but his reputation began to crumble when the past came to light. Alex, in an act of decision, revealed to Lucas' social circle the details of his connection to the destruction of his childhood family. People began to avoid him, work contracts dwindled, and he realized that the image of charm he cultivated was no longer enough to sustain his life. He tried to contact Helena, but she had completely cut ties, and for the first time in years, he found himself completely alone. It was a blow he hadn't expected, and loneliness forced him to confront the damage he'd caused. Alex eventually found new stability. He and Sophie began to build something together, but the relationship was unlike anything he had experienced before. There was no rush, there were no idealizations. They shared their stories, their pain, and found comfort in the raw honesty that existed between them. Sophie didn't try to be a substitute, and Alex didn't expect her to be. They built something solid, based on the mutual understanding that true love is not perfect, but requires work and respect. Helena finished her manuscript and, with courage, decided to publish it. To her surprise, the book was well received, and she found a new purpose. But literary success didn't erase the loneliness she felt at night, nor the moments when she wondered if Alex still thought about her. She knew she had lost something she could never get back, but she also knew that part of moving forward was accepting the choices she made and the consequences they brought. She began giving talks at literary events, talking about the importance of embracing vulnerability in learning from mistakes. The rebuilding process was slow, but she was willing to continue. As for Lucas, he disappeared from the social radar, his once imposing presence now reduced to a name people mentioned only as an example of someone who had fallen from his position. He moved to another city, starting from scratch in an environment where no one knew his history. It was a fresh start that he didn't want, but that he knew was necessary. In the end, the story of Alex, Helena and Lucas did not have perfect endings. Each of them bore the consequences of their actions, learning, growing, and facing the realities they had created for themselves. Alex finally found peace in his new life, while Helena used her pain as fuel to help others through her words. Lucas, for his part, remained a lonely figure, confronting the ghosts of his past. This story reminds us that our choices have consequences, that betrayal not only hurts, but transforms. She challenges us to reflect on the fragility of relationships and the impact of our decisions. And you, what did you think of this story? Share your opinion in the comments, we want to know what you think. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Here, we never support or justify betrayal. Our goal is to show how these acts can destroy lives, but also to teach that there is always the possibility of reconstruction. Thanks for watching and see you next time.